fact, I've had an interest in the US and Latin America for years and years. Even when I was a teenager, I was interested in Nicaragua, and I really wanted to go and see what was happening. And I finally got there in 1990, just as the Sandinistas lost the election. And basically, it was so sad to see a country. Every family knew someone who'd been killed or maimed in the Contra War, which was, of course, was funded by Reagan. The country was devastated, and I just thought that the US had put so much effort into destroying this tiny country just because they'd had a revolution and overthrown a dictator. They launched a 10-year mercenary war against Nicaragua just because they didn't want revolution in their backyard. So my interest sort of stems from then and since. But then I went on to become a journalist, and I've always had an interest in Latin America, and you can't really be interested in Latin America without developing an interest in the United States. I've tried to sort of lay out, republish a lot of these declassified documents, a lot of the evidence. Most of the book is based on official sources, US official sources, straight from the horse's mouth, if you like, so people can sort of make their own mind up and about what happened and why the US did it, and but the sources are sort of laid out for people to see, and it's also interspersed with sources from Latin America, lots of speeches by Latin American leaders and famous poets like Ruben Darío and so on, just to give a flavour of the time and give the reader a sort of sense of the history and how Latin Americans have viewed the US as well. I think most Latin Americans, certainly many Latin Americans, know the history of US intervention in Latin America, but many people in other parts of the world, particularly in the US itself, don't know that history. They don't know that their own government has really been such a barrier to reform, and worse, as a sort of supporter of dictators, a supporter of coups, a real horror. Often, obviously the US presents itself as a promoter of democracy in the world, and that's really not the case in Latin America. History shows that they've actually been a friend of dictators, and actually not only tolerated but played a part in genocide in Guatemala, the disappearance of thousands of people in the southern cone countries by dictatorships. I mean, the US played a really important role. So the book aims to make that history known to a wider public, to people in England, obviously, and in the US. The book's been published in the UK and the United States, but it hasn't been published in Latin America yet. But there is interest in both Venezuela and Mexico. Publishers are interested in publishing it there. Although there's been a lot of interest from Latin Americans and a very good reaction from Latin Americans living in London, who of course know, many of them know this history, but they're glad to see it, written down and shown to a wider audience, and they certainly. A lot of people have said, is it going to be published in the States, because they feel like the US public ought to know what's happening in their name.